What Sarah Chen doesn't realize is that beneath the crumbling foundation of her inherited ranch house lies a sealed cave containing original Apollo mission equipment worth over $50 million, gear that was supposedly destroyed decades ago, but was actually hidden by a defense contractor to cover up one of NASA's most explosive secrets. This discovery will expose a systematic cover-up involving classified moon missions, stolen technology, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of the aerospace industry. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story captures your imagination, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something even more mind-blowing lined up for you. The certified letter from Baxter Associates Law Firm had been sitting unopened on Sarah Chen's kitchen counter for 3 days before she finally worked up the courage to read it. As a 28-year-old graduate student struggling to complete her PhD in aerospace engineering at Stanford while working 2 part-time jobs to pay rent, Sarah had learned that official mail rarely brought good news. Her cramped studio apartment in Palo Alto was a testament to financial constraints, secondhand furniture, textbooks stacked everywhere, and a laptop held together with electrical tape that served as her primary research tool. The $2,100 monthly rent consumed nearly her entire graduate stipend, leaving barely enough for groceries and basic necessities. Student loan debt from her undergraduate degree at MIT had already surpassed $85,000, and her PhD research on advanced propulsion systems offered little immediate prospect of financial relief. The letter's contents defied every expectation she had formed during those 3 days of anxious speculation. Dear Ms. Chen, we regret to inform you of the passing of your great-aunt, Dr. Margaret Chen, on March 15th. As the sole surviving heir named in her will, you have inherited her property known as Whispering Pines Ranch, located in rural Kern County, California, approximately 180 miles northeast of Los Angeles. Sarah stared at the legal document, reading the same paragraph 3 times before the words began to make sense. She had never heard of Dr. Margaret Chen, had no knowledge of any family connection to a ranch in Kern County, and certainly had never expected to inherit anything more valuable than her grandmother's collection of vintage coffee mugs. The letter continued with details that seemed increasingly surreal. The property consists of 2,400 acres of high desert terrain, a primary residence constructed in 1962, multiple outbuildings, water rights, and mineral rights dating to the original homestead claim. Current assessed value for tax purposes, $1,247,000. Over $1 million. Sarah read the figure multiple times, certain there had been some clerical error. Graduate students in aerospace engineering didn't inherit million-dollar ranches from relatives they'd never heard of. Such windfalls belonged in movies or novels, not in the financial struggles of real academic life. A quick phone call to her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, a biology professor at UC Davis, revealed a family history that had been carefully hidden for nearly 30 years. Margaret was your grandfather's sister, her mother explained with obvious reluctance, her voice carrying undertones of long-suppressed anxiety. She was a brilliant engineer who worked on classified aerospace projects during the 1960s and 70s. After your grandfather died, she became reclusive. We lost touch completely when you were just a baby. Sarah pressed for details, her scientific training demanding more complete information. Mom, why haven't you ever mentioned her? If she was family, if she worked in aerospace, that's my field, why the secrecy? The pause that followed was long, enough to suggest her mother was choosing words very carefully. Margaret was involved in some kind of controversy during her NASA years. There were accusations, investigations. She left the space program under circumstances that were never fully explained. The family decided it was better to let that chapter of our history remain closed. The revelation that Sarah had a great-aunt who had worked in aerospace her own chosen field felt like discovering a missing piece of her identity. Throughout her undergraduate and graduate studies, she had often wondered if her passion for space exploration and propulsion systems was purely personal interest or something deeper. Perhaps inherited, learning that aerospace engineering ran in her family explained the intuitive understanding. She had always felt for complex propulsion, mathematics, and mission dynamics. But her mother's tone suggested there were complications to this inheritance that extended beyond simple family estrangement. The mention of accusations and investigations hinted at professional scandal that could potentially affect Sarah's own career prospects if she became associated with whatever controversy had ended Dr. Margaret Chen's NASA career. "Sarah, I need to be completely honest with you," her mother continued, her voice dropping to the careful tone she used when discussing serious academic politics. "There were allegations of theft. Maybe fraud. The details were never clear to us. She left NASA suddenly in 1975, and there were rumors about criminal investigations, though I don't think charges were ever filed. The inheritance paperwork revealed the scope of what Sarah had unexpectedly acquired. The ranch property included not just the 2,400 acres, but also sophisticated infrastructure that seemed oddly advanced for a remote desert location. The electrical systems were rated for heavy industrial use. The water well was drilled to 800 feet with backup pumping systems, and the access roads were constructed to support heavy vehicle traffic despite the property's isolation. Most intriguingly, the property survey included references to underground storage facilities and excavated installations that were not detailed in the public records, but were mentioned in the estate's insurance documentation. Someone had invested substantial resources in creating hidden infrastructure at Whispering Pines Ranch, far beyond what would be expected for a simple retirement retreat. But the inheritance also came with immediate challenges that threatened to transform this windfall into a financial burden. The ranch had been abandoned for over 15 years, with no maintenance, no utilities, and property taxes that had accumulated to $47,350 in arrears. Kern County was demanding immediate payment to prevent tax foreclosure, giving Sarah exactly 60 days to either pay the debt or lose the property entirely. Additional complications emerged as Sarah studied the legal documents more carefully. The property's mineral rights were separately owned by something called the Desert Research Foundation, creating potential conflicts over subsurface access. Water rights were disputed by 3 neighboring properties, and they were ongoing. Legal challenges related to environmental assessments required for any future development. Sarah's current financial situation made immediate payment impossible. Her graduate student stipend of $2,800 per month covered basic living expenses with nothing left over for unexpected costs, and her credit cards were already maxed out from previous emergency expenses, a laptop repair, dental work not covered by student insurance, and car maintenance that couldn't be delayed. The $47,350 tax debt might as well have been $473,500 given her current resources. The logical decision would be to sell the property immediately to a developer or ranching operation, use the proceeds to pay the tax debt, and pocket whatever remained. Several real estate agents had already contacted her within days of the inheritance becoming public record, suggesting that remote desert acreage was increasingly valuable for solar energy development, data center construction, and wealthy individuals seeking privacy for recreational compounds. Marcus Brennan from Brennan Desert Properties had been particularly persistent, calling twice and leaving detailed voicemails about immediate cash offers and expedited closing procedures. His most recent message had mentioned specific buyers who were very interested in properties with existing infrastructure and underground facilities, a reference that struck Sarah as oddly specific given that such facilities weren't mentioned in public property records. But something about her great-aunt's mysterious aerospace background and the family's deliberate silence about her career sparked Sarah's scientific curiosity. Throughout her academic training, she had learned that the most interesting discoveries often emerged from investigating anomalies that others preferred to ignore or suppress. Dr. Margaret Chen's career trajectory from successful NASA engineer to isolated desert recluse represented exactly the kind of anomaly that demanded investigation. Before making any irreversible decisions about the ranch, Sarah wanted to understand what had driven Dr. Margaret Chen to abandon a promising NASA career and retreat to 2,400 acres of isolated desert. The questions multiplied the more she thought about them. Why had someone with advanced engineering training chosen such complete isolation? What kind of work required underground facilities and heavy-duty electrical systems? And why had the family been so determined to suppress any discussion of Margaret's career and circumstances? Sarah's decision to investigate before selling was also influenced by practical considerations related to her PhD research. Her dissertation focused on propulsion system efficiency and resource allocation in long-duration space missions, exactly the kind of work that NASA engineers in the 1970s would have been conducting during the later Apollo missions and early space shuttle development. If Dr. Margaret Chen had preserved any technical documents or research materials, they could provide historical insight that would strengthen Sarah's academic work significantly. The drive from Stanford to Kern County took Sarah through landscapes that gradually transitioned from the green hills of the Bay Area to the harsh beauty of California's high desert. She had rented a sturdy SUV for the expedition, knowing that her aging Honda Civic wasn't designed for the kind of remote terrain she would be exploring. The rental costs depleted her already strained budget, but accessing the property seemed impossible without appropriate transportation. Highway 14 carried her through the Antelope Valley, past Edwards Air Force Base where so much aerospace history had been made. Seeing the sprawling military installation reminded Sarah of the classification levels and security protocols that had governed aerospace work during Dr. Margaret Chen's era. The secrecy surrounding experimental aircraft and space missions in the 1960s and 70s had been absolute, creating opportunities for both legitimate security protection and potential abuse by those with access to classified resources. Whispering Pines Ranch was located 40 miles from the nearest town of Ridgecrest, accessible only by a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere but deeper into a landscape of Joshua trees, scattered boulders, and mountains that shimmered in the distance like mirages. The isolation was profound. No cell phone coverage, no visible neighbors, no indication that human civilization existed anywhere nearby. The ranch house sat in a shallow valley surrounded by low hills, its mid-century modern architecture looking surprisingly sophisticated for such a remote location. The building's clean lines and extensive windows suggested it had been designed by someone with architectural knowledge and substantial financial resources. It's not the typical homestead structure that might be expected in such an isolated area. Sarah's first impression was of profound abandonment mixed with evidence of original sophistication. 15 years without maintenance had taken their toll on everything from the roof to the foundation. Several windows were broken, the front door hung askew on rusted hinges, and tumbleweeds had accumulated against the walls and drifts that reached nearly to the windowsills. But even in its deteriorated condition, the ranch house retained evidence of the intelligence and sophistication of its original owner. The interior revealed a layout designed for both comfortable living and serious intellectual work. What had once been the living room contained built-in bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, with custom lighting and climate control systems that suggested valuable books or documents had once been stored there. A large office space featured custom workbenches with built-in electrical systems, ventilation hoods, and mounting points for scientific equipment. The electrical infrastructure was far more sophisticated than typical residential installation, with multiple dedicated circuits, specialized grounding systems, and what appeared to be connections for three-phase industrial power that would never be needed for normal household purposes. Most intriguingly, the house's basement was far more extensive than the modest ranch structure above would suggest. The basement level contained multiple rooms with reinforced concrete walls, advanced ventilation systems, and electrical infrastructure that seemed designed for equipment requiring precise environmental controls. The construction quality was exceptional, with waterproofing and structural elements that suggested this space had been built to last centuries rather than decades. Sarah found herself wondering what kind of work had required such elaborate facilities. The basement's design suggested laboratory or workshop space for technical equipment that generated heat, required precise temperature control, or produced emissions that needed sophisticated ventilation. This wasn't the basement of someone engaged in casual hobbies. It was infrastructure designed for serious scientific or engineering work. The first boxes of documents Sarah discovered in the basement office began to reveal the scope of her greatness, work, and the complexity of her departure from NASA. Dr. Margaret Chen had been a propulsion systems engineer who had worked on classified projects related to lunar mission equipment, advanced rocket engines, and experimental spacecraft components during the height of the Apollo program. The documents painted a picture of a brilliant engineer who had been involved in some of the most sensitive technical work of the space race. Her personnel files, which she had apparently retained copies of, showed consistent, outstanding performance evaluations, security clearance renewals at the highest levels, and supervisory responsibilities for teams working on mission-critical propulsion systems. But they also revealed growing tensions between Dr. Chen and her supervisors over issues related to equipment accountability, budget irregularities, and what she described in personal notes as systematic misrepresentation of mission parameters and equipment specifications. One memo, dated September 1975, was particularly revealing in its detail and implications. The discrepancies between reported equipment disposition and actual mission requirements have become impossible to ignore or rationalize through normal explanations. Technical components valued at millions of dollars are being reported as destroyed during testing or lost during mission operations, when I have direct knowledge that these items were never launched, never tested to failure, and never properly accounted for through normal inventory procedures. The paperwork creates fictional narratives about equipment disposition that bear no resemblance to the actual fate of these materials. Another document, apparently part of a formal complaint to NASA oversight officials, detailed Dr. Chun's concerns about what she termed systematic diversion of mission-critical equipment for undisclosed purposes. I have documented at least 14 instances where advanced propulsion components, life support systems, and scientific instruments were removed from official mission inventories without proper authorization or documentation. When I have requested clarification about the disposition of these items, I have been told that such information is classified above my clearance level, despite my direct involvement in their design and development. This classification claim is being used to prevent normal accountability procedures from being applied to equipment worth millions of taxpayer dollars. The documentation became increasingly detailed and specific as Dr. Chen's concerns escalated into formal allegations. She had created meticulous inventories comparing official NASA records with actual equipment deliveries, identifying systematic patterns of missing materials that suggested organized theft rather than random accounting errors. The missing equipment includes complete propulsion modules designed for lunar ascent vehicles, life support systems rated for extended missions, and scientific instruments that were specifically designed for surface operations on the moon. These are not items that could be misplaced or accidentally destroyed. They represent sophisticated technology that required years of development and millions of dollars into specialized manufacturing. Their disappearance from official records, while never being used for their intended purposes, suggests deliberate diversion for unknown purposes. The documents suggested that Dr. Margaret Chen had uncovered evidence of systematic theft or misappropriation of NASA equipment by defense contractors, and that her attempts to report these irregularities had resulted in retaliation, investigation, and ultimately her forced departure from the space program. Reading through her great-aunt's meticulous documentation, Sarah began to understand why the family had chosen to distance themselves from Margaret's aerospace career. The accusations of equipment theft and contractor fraud involved some of the most powerful companies in the defense industry, and the political implications of such allegations during the Cold War would have been enormous. Titan Aerospace Corporation appeared repeatedly in Dr. Chen's documentation as the primary contractor involved in the equipment irregularities. Founded in 1958 by former military officials, Titan had built its reputation on exclusive contracts for spacecraft, propulsion systems, and had maintained close relationships with both NASA and the Pentagon throughout the space race. The company's founder, General Harrison Blackwood, is a decorated World War II. He's a veteran who had transitioned into aerospace contracting with the explicit support of high-ranking military and political officials. Dr. Chen's allegations suggested that Titan Aerospace had been systematically diverting NASA equipment for use in classified military projects, creating false documentation about equipment testing and disposal, while actually incorporating advanced space technology into weapons, systems, and surveillance platforms that generated enormous profits through separate defense contracts. General Blackwood has repeatedly stated in contractor meetings that space technology belongs to American defense interests, not academic researchers. Dr. Chen had noted in one particularly damning memo. He has made clear that Titan Aerospace views NASA's civilian mission as secondary to military applications of space technology, and that equipment diversion serves higher national security priorities than the space exploration programs for which the technology was originally developed. But Sarah also realized that her great-aunt's isolation at Whispering Pines Ranch might not have been simple retreat from professional disappointment. The extensive basement facilities, the sophisticated electrical systems, and the remote location suggested that Dr. Margaret Chen might have been conducting her own research or preserving evidence that she believed would someday be needed to expose the corruption she had. As Sarah explored the ranch property beyond the main house, she discovered additional structures that reinforced her suspicion that her great-aunt's retirement had been far from passive. A large workshop building contained machine tools, testing equipment, and technical instruments that would have been expensive and sophisticated even by current standards. Some of the equipment bore manufacturer labels from the 1970s, but appeared to have been maintained in operational condition until, relatively recently. The workshop's capabilities were impressive. Precision milling machines, spectrographic analysis equipment, vacuum chambers for material testing, and electronic instruments for measuring electromagnetic properties. This wasn't a hobbyist's garage. Workshop Hit was a serious technical facility capable of analyzing and reverse engineering sophisticated aerospace components. Most mysteriously, she found evidence of excavation work that had been conducted in the hills behind the ranch house. Several areas showed signs of careful digging and rock removal, the access roads that had been carved into hillsides leading to locations that were not visible from the main ranch buildings or from any public vantage point. The excavation sites were too extensive and systematic to be casual exploration or hobby prospecting. Someone had invested considerable time, effort, and expertise in creating hidden installations that were designed to be undetectable from ground level or aerial observation. The access roads were engineered with proper drainage and reinforcement, suggesting they had been built to support heavy vehicle traffic over extended periods. At one excavation site, Sarah discovered the entrance to what appeared to be a tunnel or cave system that had been sealed with a heavy steel door. The door was secured with a sophisticated locking mechanism that required both a physical key and what appeared to be an electronic access code. Rust and weather damage had affected the external hardware. The underlying construction appeared solid and designed for long-term security. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a systematic project that had required significant resources, specialized knowledge, and careful planning. Dr. Margaret Chen hadn't simply retreated to the desert to live quietly. She had created a hidden research installation designed to protect something of enormous value or sensitivity. That evening, as Sarah sat in the abandoned ranch house reviewing her great-aunt's documents by flashlight, she faced a decision that would determine not just her own financial future, but potentially her entire career trajectory. The smart, safe choice would be to sell the property immediately, pay off the tax debt, and return to her graduate studies with enough money to complete her PhD without financial stress. The documents she had discovered were fascinating from a historical perspective, but pursuing their implications would mean delaying her degree, exhausting her limited financial resources, and potentially associating herself with allegations of government contractor fraud that could damage her future career prospects in the aerospace industry. Or she could invest her limited resources in paying the property taxes, keeping the ranch, and investigating the mysteries that Dr. Margaret Chen had left behind. This path would mean financial sacrifice, academic delay, and the possibility of uncovering secrets that powerful interests had spent decades concealing. The decision was complicated by a growing sense that her great-aunt's work might be directly relevant to her own aerospace engineering research. Sarah's PhD dissertation focused on propulsion system efficiency and lunar mission logistics. exactly the areas where Dr. Margaret Chen had identified systematic irregularities and equipment disappearances. If her great-aunt had preserved evidence of contractor fraud and equipment theft, that information could be crucial for understanding historical problems in aerospace development that continued to affect current mission planning and resource allocation. The missing equipment that Dr. Chen had documented represented technologies that could advance current space exploration capabilities if they could be recovered and analyzed. More personally, Sarah felt a deep connection to the brilliant woman who had chosen principle over career advancement, scientific integrity over institutional loyalty, and truth over convenience. Dr. Margaret Chen had apparently sacrificed everything to preserve evidence of wrongdoing that she believed would someday serve justice and scientific advancement. The isolation that had characterized the final decades of Dr. Chen's life represented not withdrawal from the world, but preparation for eventual vindication. The hidden excavations, the preserved documents, and the sophisticated workshop facilities all suggested that she had been methodically building a case that would expose corruption and recover stolen technology when the time was right. As midnight approached in the isolated ranch house, with coyotes calling in the distance and stars visible with a clarity impossible in any city, Sarah Chen made the decision that would change her life forever. She would find a way to pay the property taxes, keep Whispering Pines Ranch, and discover what her great-aunt had hidden in the hills of Kern County. The next morning, Sarah began the process of securing an emergency loan against her future graduate stipend to cover the immediate tax debt. The process would require her to sign over her next 3 years of academic income, leaving her with barely enough to survive on while completing her PhD. It would mean years of financial constraint, delayed graduation, and academic sacrifice that would affect her career prospects for years to come. But it would also mean honoring the legacy of a woman who had chosen integrity over comfort and truth over convenience. Dr. Margaret Chen had preserved evidence of systematic fraud and equipment theft that could still serve justice and scientific advancement if someone was willing to continue her work. Sarah had no idea that her decision to investigate her great-aunt's secrets would lead to the discovery of equipment that was supposed to have been destroyed 40 years ago, or that her findings would ultimately expose a conspiracy involving some of the most powerful corporations in the aerospace industry. But as she packed her belongings to relocate temporarily to Whispering Pines Ranch, Chen felt the same determination that had driven her great-aunt to sacrifice everything for scientific integrity and truth. The hidden excavation sites beckoned with the promise of answers to questions that had remained secret for nearly half a century. The steel door in the hillside represented more than just a physical barrier. It was the threshold between her current life as a struggling graduate student and a future that could include discoveries that would transform both her own understanding and humanity's knowledge of what had really happened during the golden age of space exploration. The real adventure was just beginning. The emergency loan process took Sarah 3 weeks of bureaucratic navigation, multiple trips to different banks, and ultimately required her mother to co-sign the agreement using her own home as additional collateral. The final loan amount of $52,000 covered the property taxes, basic utilities, restoration, and minimal living expenses for the next 6 months, but left Sarah with debt obligations that would extend well beyond her PhD completion. Dr. Linda Chen had agreed to the co-signing reluctantly, extracting a promise from Sarah that she would limit her investigation to 6 months. Before making a final decision about the property's future, "I understand your curiosity about Margaret," her mother had said during their final discussion. "But I won't watch you destroy your academic career chasing ghosts from a family scandal that ended 40 years ago." Sarah understood her mother's concerns, but she also felt compelled by something deeper than mere curiosity. The systematic documentation that Dr. Margaret Chen had preserved suggested crimes that had affected the entire American space program, potentially costing taxpayers millions of dollars while denying humanity access to technologies that could have advanced space exploration by decades. Returning to Whispering Pines Ranch with a U-Haul trailer containing her essential belongings felt like crossing into a different world. The isolation that had initially seemed daunting now offered freedom from academic pressures and social expectations that had constrained her. Thinking throughout graduate school, you're surrounded by 2,400 acres of high desert and her gardens. Mysterious legacy, Sarah could pursue questions that conventional academic research would never have permitted. The first priority was making the ranch house habitable. Kern County utility crews restored electricity and water service, revealing that the infrastructure was far more sophisticated than typical residential systems. Electrical service included three-phase industrial power, multiple dedicated circuits for heavy equipment, and backup generator connections that suggested the original owner had prioritized reliable power above all other considerations. The water system was equally impressive. The main well, drilled to 800 feet, delivered water with mineral content and purity that exceeded municipal standards. Backup pumping systems, storage tanks, and filtration equipment indicated that Dr. Margaret Chen had prepared for extended self-sufficiency in an environment where utility disruptions could be catastrophic. With basic services restored, Sarah began a systematic exploration of her Great Tance documentation, treating the investigation like the rigorous research project it had become. She established a workspace in the basement office, cataloging documents chronologically and cross-referencing Dr. Chen's allegations with publicly available NASA mission records and contractor agreements. The deeper Sarah delved into the documentation, the more sophisticated Dr. Margaret Chen's investigation appeared. Her gratin hadn't simply noticed missing equipment, she had documented a systematic pattern of fraud that involved multiple defense contractors, NASA officials, military personnel across several years of Apollo program operations. Dr. Chen's files contained copies of internal NASA memos, contractor shipping records, and financial documents that revealed a complex scheme for diverting space program equipment to undisclosed military projects. The missing items weren't random components, but carefully selected technologies that could be adapted for weapons systems, surveillance platforms, and other classified military applications. One particularly detailed analysis, dated December 1974, provided a comprehensive overview of the scheme's scope and methodology. The equipment diversion operation appears to follow a consistent, advanced space technologies are ordered through normal NASA procurement procedures, delivered to contractor facilities for testing and integration, then reported as destroyed during testing or lost during mission operations, while actually being incorporated into classified military projects that generate substantial additional revenue for the contractor. Dr. Chen had identified specific examples that illustrated the pattern with shocking clarity. A lunar module ascent engine, officially reported as destroyed during ground testing, had actually been delivered to a classified Air Force facility where it was being adapted for a military reconnaissance satellite. Life support systems designed for extended lunar missions were being incorporated into submarine technology. Scientific instruments developed for planetary exploration were being modified for intelligence-gathering operations. The financial implications were staggering. Dr. Chen estimated that over $200 million worth of NASA equipment had been diverted between 1970 and 1975, generating additional military contract revenue that exceeded $500 million for the participating contractors. The taxpayers had funded the development of advanced space technologies that were then stolen and sold back to the government through separate military contracts at enormous markups. But the documentation also revealed that Dr. Chen had gone far beyond simply cataloging the fraud. Beginning in 1974, she had begun secretly photographing equipment, copying documents, creating detailed records that could serve as evidence in criminal prosecutions. Her basement office contained a sophisticated photographic darkroom where she had processed thousands of images documenting equipment that was supposed to have been destroyed. Most significantly, Sarah discovered evidence that Dr. Chen had actually recovered some of the stolen equipment. Shipping records and transportation logs indicated that she had somehow acquired access to items that were being illicitly transferred, documenting their specifications and preserving them as physical evidence of the ongoing fraud. A series of journal entries from late 1975 revealed how Dr. Chen had accomplished this remarkable feat. My access to contractor shipping schedules and transportation routes has allowed me to intercept several equipment transfers that were not properly documented through official channels. The contractors have become careless about security, assuming that their political protection makes detection impossible. They transport stolen NASA equipment using commercial trucking companies with minimal security, creating opportunities for recovery by someone with advanced knowledge of their operations. Sarah realized she was reading about what amounted to a one-woman counterintelligence operation. Dr. Margaret Chen had been systematically infiltrating the contractor fraud network, recovering stolen equipment, and building a comprehensive case that could expose the entire conspiracy. The isolation of Whispering Pines Ranch hadn't been retreat. It had been the perfect location for hiding recovered equipment while preparing for eventual prosecution of the perpetrators. The documentation included detailed maps and photographs of the excavation sites Sarah had discovered, revealing that the hidden installations were actually sophisticated storage facilities designed to preserve recovered NASA equipment in controlled environmental conditions. Dr. Chen had essentially created a secret museum of stolen space program technology, waiting for the right moment to reveal the evidence and expose the conspiracy. But Sarah also discovered why that moment had never come. FBI surveillance reports, apparently obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests years later, revealed that Dr. Chen had been under investigation from 1975 until her death. The Bureau had been monitoring her activities at the ranch, attempting to determine whether she possessed evidence that could damage national security or expose classified military programs. The FBI files, heavily redacted but still illuminating, described Dr. Chen as a potential security risk, who possessed unauthorized access to classified materials related to military applications of space technology. The investigation had been requested by defense contractor officials who claimed that Dr. Chen had stolen proprietary information and equipment from their facilities. Reading the FBI files, Sarah understood the terrible irony of her great situation. Dr. Margaret Chen had been trying to expose the theft of government property by defense contractors. But the same contractors had convinced federal law enforcement that she was the criminal. The systematic surveillance and harassment had effectively prevented her from revealing the evidence she had gathered, forcing her to remain in hiding at the ranch while the real criminals continued their operations with impunity. The surveillance had been comprehensive and sophisticated. FBI agents had monitored Dr. Chen's communications, tracked her movements, and maintained visual observation of the ranch using equipment positioned on nearby hills. The investigation files included photographs of the excavation work and speculation about what Dr. Chen might be hiding in the underground installations. Most ominously, files revealed that the FBI investigation had been coordinated with Titan Aerospace Corporation officials, who had provided agents with detailed information about Dr. Chen's NASA background and her allegations against their company. General Harrison Blackwood had personally briefed federal agents about what he characterized as Dr. Chen's delusional allegations and unstable behavior following her termination from NASA for security violations. Sarah now understood why her family had been so reluctant to discuss Dr. Margaret Chen's circumstances. Her gradant hadn't simply left NASA under a cloud of suspicion. She had spent the last decades of her life as a virtual prisoner on her own property, unable to reveal the evidence she had gathered without facing federal prosecution for crimes she hadn't committed. But the documentation also revealed that Dr. Chen had anticipated this dilemma and had taken steps to ensure that her evidence would eventually be discovered and properly presented. Hidden throughout the ranch property were additional caches, photographic records, and detailed instructions for accessing the underground storage facilities. One envelope, marked for my successor in Dr. Chen's careful handwriting, contained a comprehensive guide to the evidence she had preserved, and instructions for safely revealing it without triggering the same government retaliation that had silenced her. If you are reading this, the letter began, then I have died without seeing justice for the crimes I have documented. The evidence I have preserved represents proof of systematic theft from the American space program. It's fraud that has cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars while denying humanity access to technologies that could transform our future among the stars. Dr. Chen's letter outlined a specific strategy for revealing the evidence safely. The equipment I have recovered must be presented through legitimate scientific institutions that can verify its authenticity and significance. NASA officials who were not involved in the original conspiracy must be contacted directly. Congressional oversight committees must be provided with complete documentation before any public revelations. The evidence must be presented as a complete case that cannot be suppressed or discredited through partial disclosures. Most importantly, the letter provided specific information about the location and contents of the main storage facility. The primary cache is located beneath the sealed door you have undoubtedly discovered in the Eastern Hills. The access codes are based on the launch dates of Apollo missions 11, 12, and 14. The facility contains original NASA equipment worth millions of dollars, including complete propulsion systems, life support equipment, and scientific instruments that were reported as destroyed but were actually stolen for military applications. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation as she absorbed the implications of her great aunt's revelations. The sealed door she had found wasn't just hiding documents or photographs, it was protecting a cache of original Apollo program equipment that had been missing for 40 years. The potential significance was staggering. If Dr. Chen had truly preserved functioning examples of 1970s NASA technology, that equipment could provide insights into space program capabilities that had been lost when the original documentation was destroyed or classified. Modern aerospace engineers could analyze the components to understand design principles and manufacturing techniques that might improve current space exploration technologies. But Sarah also understood the dangers involved in revealing such evidence. The same defense contractors who had benefited from the original theft were now among the most powerful companies in the aerospace industry. Titan Aerospace Corporation had grown into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with extensive government contracts and political influence. Exposing their historical crimes could trigger retaliation that would make Dr. Chen's surveillance and harassment seem modest by comparison. The next morning, Sarah began the process of accessing the underground storage facility, using Dr. Chen's instructions to calculate the access codes based on Apollo mission launch dates. The first attempt with Apollo 11's launch date, July 16, 1969, activated the electronic locks programming sequence. Adding Apollo 12's launch date, November 19, 1969, as a secondary code triggered additional mechanical systems. The final code, based on Apollo 14's launch date, January 31, 1971, disengaged the final security mechanisms with a series of heavy metallic clicks that echoed through the hillside. The steel door opened to reveal a tunnel that had been carved directly into the solid rock of the hillside. Reinforced with concrete and equipped with ventilation systems that had maintained stable environmental conditions for decades. LED lighting systems, apparently installed with backup power supplies, illuminated a passageway that extended deep into the mountain. The tunnel led to a series of interconnected chambers that represented one of the most sophisticated private storage facilities Sarah had ever seen. The main chamber was the size of a large warehouse, with climate control systems, dehumidification equipment, and specialized storage racks designed to protect sensitive equipment from environmental damage. But it was the contents of the facility that left Sarah speechless with amazement and scientific excitement. The storage racks contained dozens of components that were unmistakably from the Apollo program era. Propulsion system modules bore NASA identification numbers and contractor specifications that matched the equipment Dr. Chen had documented as missing from official inventories. Life support systems displayed the distinctive design characteristics of 1970s space technology, with heavy mechanical components and analog control systems that predated modern electronic miniaturization. Most impressive was a complete lunar module ascent engine, still mounted in its original test framework, with documentation showing it had been scheduled for Apollo 18, mission that had been canceled in 1970, but whose equipment had apparently been preserved rather than destroyed, as officially reported. Sarah recognized the historical significance of what she was seeing. The Apollo program had been terminated before achieving its full potential. With planned missions canceled and equipment supposedly destroyed for budget reasons, but here was proof that the equipment had actually been preserved, creating opportunities for analysis and potential reuse that the American space program had abandoned. The scientific instruments were equally remarkable. Lunar sample analysis equipment, planetary surface exploration tools, and atmospheric monitoring systems represented technologies that had been decades ahead of their time. Modern space missions could benefit enormously from understanding the design principles and manufacturing techniques that had created such sophisticated equipment in the 1970s. But Sarah also found evidence that some of the equipment had been more than just preserved. It had been actively maintained and upgraded. Dr. Chen had apparently spent years analyzing the recovered components, creating detailed technical documentation, and even implementing improvements based on her own engineering expertise. Workstation contained a complete analysis of a lunar module guidance computer, with Dr. Chen's notes comparing the original 1970s technology to potential improvements using more advanced electronic components. She had essentially reverse-engineered the entire system, creating specifications that could allow modern manufacturers to reproduce the equipment with enhanced capabilities. The implications for current space exploration were enormous. Current Artemis program, designed to return astronauts to the moon, was struggling with many of the same technical challenges that had been solved by Apollo program engineers decades earlier. Access to preserved original equipment could accelerate development and reduce costs by billions of dollars. But as Sarah explored the facility more thoroughly, she discovered evidence that Dr. Chen's recovery operation had been even more extensive than her documentation had suggested. Additional storage areas contained equipment from programs that had never been publicly acknowledged, including what appeared to be components for classified military space missions that had been conducted parallel to the civilian Apollo program. One section of the facility was entirely dedicated to equipment, marked with designation codes that didn't match any publicly known NASA programs. The components bore manufacturing dates from the mid-1970s, but displayed design characteristics that seemed decades ahead of publicly acknowledged space technology capabilities. Sarah realized she had discovered evidence of classified space programs that had continued after the official end of the Apollo era, using technology that had been diverted from civilian missions to develop military capabilities that remained secret decades later. Dr. Chen hadn't just exposed contractor fraud, she had uncovered proof of an entirely parallel space program that had been hidden from public knowledge and congressional oversight. The documentation that accompanied this classified equipment was even more explosive than the civilian Apollo materials. Dr. Chen had preserved evidence of military space missions that had placed surveillance satellites in lunar orbit, conducted classified experiments on the moon's surface, and developed space-based weapon systems that violated international treaties. Most shocking was evidence of what appeared to be a classified lunar base construction project that had been conducted using equipment officially allocated to canceled Apollo missions. The project, designated Artemis Black in the documentation, had apparently established a permanent military installation on the moon's far side, using technology that was supposed to have been destroyed when the civilian space program was curtailed. Sarah found herself confronting evidence of government deception that extended far beyond simple contractor fraud. The American space program had apparently continued in classified form while the public was told that budget constraints had ended. Lunar exploration. The missing NASA equipment hadn't just been stolen for profit, had been diverted to classified military programs that had achieved capabilities the civilian space program had been denied. As she photographed and cataloged the evidence, Sarah understood that she was documenting one of the most significant government cover-ups in American history. The implications extended beyond aerospace policy to fundamental questions about democratic oversight of military activities and the use of public resources for classified programs that had never been authorized by Congress. But she also realized that revealing such evidence would trigger opposition from the most powerful interests in the American military-industrial complex. The classified space programs she had discovered represented investments of billions of dollars and decades of development. The individuals and organizations responsible for these programs would have enormous incentives to prevent exposure, regardless of the legal or ethical cost of suppression. That evening, as Sarah sat in the underground facility, surrounded by evidence that could revolutionize understanding of American space capabilities. She felt the weight of responsibility that had driven her Grayton to spend decades in isolation. Dr. Margaret Chen had preserved this evidence at enormous personal cost, knowing that revealing it would require someone willing to confront the most powerful interests in American society. The choice Sarah faced was no longer simply about completing her PhD or resolving her financial problems. She had become the guardian of evidence that could expose systematic fraud, reveal classified military programs, and potentially transform humanity's future in space. If she could find a way to present it without being destroyed by the same forces that had silenced her Grayton for 40 years, the sealed underground facility represented more than just storage space for stolen equipment. It was a time capsule from an era when individual integrity had confronted institutional corruption. When one brilliant engineer had chosen truth over career advancement and justice over personal safety, now it was Sarah's turn to decide whether that sacrifice would be honored or whether the evidence would remain hidden for another generation. Waiting for someone else with the courage to challenge the powers that had turned humanity's greatest adventure into a source of profit and military advantage. The real battle for the truth about America's space program was about to begin. Sarah's first priority after documenting the underground facility was establishing the authenticity of what she had discovered. The equipment appeared genuine, but 40 years of isolation had left questions about its condition and provenance that only expert analysis could resolve. Moreover, making any public claims about Apollo program equipment would require validation from credible scientific authorities who could confirm her findings independently. The challenge was finding experts who could provide such validation without alerting the same interests that had silenced Dr. Margaret Chen. Sarah needed aerospace engineers with sufficient expertise to recognize authentic Apollo hardware, but also individuals who were independent enough to resist pressure from defense contractors or government agencies that might prefer the equipment to remain hidden. Her first contact was Dr. Robert Morrison, a retired NASA engineer who had worked on Apollo program propulsion systems and now taught aerospace engineering at the California Institute of Technology. Dr. Morrison's published papers on lunar module design made him one of the world's leading experts on the specific equipment that Sarah had discovered, and his academic position provided some protection from direct corporate pressure. The initial phone conversation was carefully worded, Sarah describing her discovery as inherited aerospace equipment with potential historical significance. Rather than making specific claims about stolen NASA hardware, Dr. Morrison's response was professionally cautious but intrigued enough to agree to a preliminary consultation. Chen? He said after hearing her general description, authentic Apollo program equipment is extraordinarily rare. Most components were either used in missions, destroyed during testing, or remain in NASA's possession for historical preservation. Any privately held items would require extensive documentation to establish their legitimacy. Dr. Morrison agreed. To visit Whispering Pines Ranch the following week, bring in portable analysis, equipment that could perform non-destructive testing on the components Sarah had found. His expertise would be crucial for establishing whether the equipment was genuine Apollo hardware or sophisticated replicas that might have been created for training or testing purposes. While waiting for Dr. Morrison's visit, Sarah continued her analysis of Dr. Chen's documentation, focusing particularly on the evidence related to classified military space programs. The Artemis black materials suggested capabilities that exceeded anything publicly acknowledged about American space operations, raising questions about what the government had actually achieved during the height of Cold War competition with the Soviet Union. The classified program documentation included mission logs, technical specifications, and even photographic evidence of installations that appeared to be located on the lunar surface. The photographs showed structures that were clearly artificial, with geometric shapes and technological components that could not be natural formations. Most remarkable were images that appeared to show American astronauts working at a lunar installation that bore no resemblance to the temporary Apollo landing sites that had been publicly documented. The installation featured permanent structures, extensive equipment, and infrastructure that suggested long-term occupation rather than brief exploration missions. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of achievements that would revolutionize public understanding of human space capabilities. If the United States had actually established a permanent lunar presence in the 1970s, that accomplishment represented one of the greatest technological and logistical achievements in human history and one of the most significant government secrets ever maintained. But the implications extended beyond historical curiosity to current space policy and international relations. If America had possessed advanced space capabilities for decades, while publicly claiming that budget constraints had ended lunar exploration, that deception had profound implications for treaty obligations, military doctrine, and the civilian space program's resource allocation. The documentation suggested that the classified space programs had continued through the 1980s and 1990s, using technology that had been continuously upgraded and expanded while the public NASA program struggled with limited budgets and technical challenges. The Space Shuttle program, presented to the public as America's primary space capability, had apparently been supplemented by classified systems that provided access to capabilities far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. Dr. Morrison's arrival at Whispering Pines Ranch marked a turning point in Sarah's investigation. The retired NASA engineer's reaction to the underground facility was immediate and dramatic, confirming Sarah's hope that the equipment was as significant as it appeared. "My God," Dr. Morrison whispered as he examined the lunar module ascent engine. "This is LM-18, the ascent stage that was supposed to have been destroyed when Apollo 18 was canceled. I worked on this specific engine during its development and testing phases." His examination of the engine's components was meticulous and emotionally, with Dr. Morrison identifying specific design features and manufacturing details that confirmed the authenticity of what Sarah had preserved. The engine bore inspection stamps, serial numbers, and technical modifications that matched his personal knowledge of Apollo program hardware. "This engine represents millions of dollars of development and some of the most advanced propulsion technology ever created," Dr. Morrison explained as he photographed the component systems. "The fact that it was preserved, rather than destroyed, means that someone understood its historical and technical significance far better than the SCE bureaucrats who ordered its disposal." But Dr. Morrison's excitement about the propulsion hardware was overshadowed by his amazement at the scope of equipment that Dr. Chen had accumulated. Life support systems, guidance computers, scientific instruments, and communication equipment represented a comprehensive collection that could support detailed analysis of Apollo program capabilities and design principles. "Ms. Chen, what you've preserved here represents one of the most significant collections of Apollo hardware outside of NASA's own archives," Dr. Morrison said as he completed his preliminary examination.
Ow.
"This equipment could provide insights into 1970s space technology that would be invaluable for current lunar exploration programs." His technical analysis confirmed that the equipment was not only authentic, but had been maintained in remarkably good condition. Dr. Chen's environmental controls and preservation methods had protected the components from degradation that would normally be expected after 40 years of storage. Most importantly, Dr. Morrison's expertise allowed him to recognize the classified military equipment that Sarah had discovered alongside the civilian Apollo components. His security clearance from his NASA years provided him with knowledge of classified programs that enabled him to understand the true significance of what Dr. Chen had preserved. "Sarah, some of this equipment bears designation codes that I recognize from classified briefings during my NASA career," Dr. Morrison said, his voice becoming more serious as he examined the military hardware. "These components were part of programs that were never publicly acknowledged, and their existence here raises very serious questions about how they were acquired." Dr. Morrison's recognition of the classified equipment provided the expert validation that Sarah needed, but it also confirmed her fears about the potential consequences of revealing her discovery. The retired NASA engineer's expression grew increasingly troubled as he understood the implications of what he was seeing. If this equipment was diverted from classified military programs, then revealing its existence could trigger national security investigations and potential criminal charges, he warned. The people responsible for these programs had enormous resources and political influence, and they would have every incentive to prevent exposure regardless of the cost. But Dr. Morrison also understood the scientific and historical importance of what Sarah had discovered. The preserved Apollo equipment represented irreplaceable examples of technology that had been lost when the original program was terminated, while the classified military hardware provided evidence of capabilities that could transform understanding of American space achievements. Sarah, you're facing the same dilemma that your Gretton confronted 40 years ago, Dr. Morrison said as they concluded their examination of the facility. This evidence is too important to remain hidden, but revealing it safely will require careful planning and powerful allies who can protect you from retaliation. Dr. Morrison's validation of the equipment's significance led Sarah to expand her outreach to additional experts who could provide independent confirmation and help develop a strategy for safely revealing her discovery. Her next contact was Dr. Amanda Wright, director of the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, whose expertise in space program history and museum preservation made her an ideal authority for establishing the equipment's historical significance. The initial conversation with Dr. Wright was even more carefully structured than the discussion with Dr. Morrison. Given the Smithsonian's official relationship with NASA and potential sensitivity to government pressure, Sarah described her discovery as inherited space program artifacts with potential museum significance. Focusing on historical preservation rather than allegations of theft or fraud, Dr. Wright's response revealed both professional excitement and institutional caution. Ms. Chen, authentic Apollo program hardware is extraordinarily valuable from both historical and educational perspectives, she said. The Smithsonian would certainly be interested in examining any such materials, though we would need extensive documentation and authentication before making any commitments regarding acquisition or display. Sarah arranged for Dr. Wright to visit the ranch the following month, providing time to prepare additional documentation and coordinate her visit with Dr. Morrison's continued analysis. The involvement of the Smithsonian would provide institutional credibility that could protect Sarah from accusations of fraud or theft, while also ensuring that any public revelation of the equipment would be handled through legitimate educational channels. But Sarah's outreach to legitimate authorities also triggered the attention of interests that preferred the equipment to remain hidden. Within days of Dr. Morrison's visit to the ranch, Sarah began receiving phone calls from individuals who claimed to represent various government agencies and defense contractors. The first call came from someone who identified himself as Agent David Kellerman from the Department of Defense's Defense Security Service. His tone was professionally courteous but carried undertones of authority and implied threat. Ms. Chen, we understand that you may have come into possession of materials that could be subject to federal security classifications, Agent Kellerman said. We'd like to schedule a visit to your property to ensure that any such materials are properly secured and handled according to appropriate protocols. Sarah's response was carefully non-committal, acknowledging the agent's request while avoiding any specific admissions about what she had discovered. Agent Kellerman, I'd be happy to cooperate with any legitimate federal investigation, but I'd need to see proper documentation of your authority, in specific evidence of security violations before allowing access to my property. The agent's response revealed the pressure tactics that Dr. Chen had apparently faced decades earlier. Ms. Chen, cooperation with federal security investigations is not optional when classified materials may be involved. Obstruction of such investigations can result in serious criminal charges regardless of how the materials were initially acquired. The threat was clear but legally questionable, since Agent Kellerman had provided no specific evidence that classified materials were actually present at the ranch, or that Sarah had violated any federal regulations. His pressure tactics suggested that the government's interest was based on assumptions and surveillance, rather than legitimate law enforcement investigation. Sarah's second unwelcome contact came from Bradley Harrison, who identified himself as a senior executive with Titan Aerospace Corporation. His approach was more sophisticated than the government agent's direct threats, focusing on corporate partnership and mutual benefit rather than legal compulsion. Ms. Chen, Titan Aerospace, has a long history of responsible stewardship for sensitive aerospace materials, Harrison said during their phone conversation. If you've inherited equipment that originated from our contracts with NASA, we'd be very interested in discussing acquisition arrangements that would serve both your financial interests and our corporate responsibility for proprietary technology. The corporate approach was more appealing than government threats, but Sarah recognized the same manipulative tactics that Dr. Chen had documented in her files. Escalating Aerospace was essentially offering to purchase silence while claiming legitimate ownership of equipment that had been stolen from taxpayer-funded programs. Mr. Harrison, I appreciate your interest, but any equipment I may have inherited would need to be properly evaluated by independent experts before I could consider any transfer arrangements. Oh, Sarah replied, maintaining the careful ambiguity that had characterized all her conversations with potentially hostile interests. Harrison's response revealed the corporate pressure that would likely escalate if Sarah refused to cooperate voluntarily. Ms. Chen should point out that Titan Aerospace has extensive legal resources and government relationships that enable us to protect our intellectual property rights very aggressively. Always prefer cooperative arrangements, but we're prepared to pursue all available legal remedies if necessary. The corporate threat was more subtle than the government agent's warnings, but equally clear in its implications. Titan Aerospace was prepared to use their political influence and legal resources to claim ownership of the equipment. Regardless of Sarah's legitimate inheritance rights or the historical evidence of theft that Dr. Chen had preserved, Sarah's third contact was the most disturbing because it came from someone who claimed personal knowledge of Dr. Margaret Chen's circumstances during her final years. The caller identified himself only as Marcus and suggested that he had been involved in the surveillance operation that had monitored Dr. Chen's activities at the ranch. Ms. Chen, your grattant was a brilliant woman who got involved in something far beyond her ability to control, Marcus said, his voice carrying both respect and warning. She spent 40 years hiding evidence that could destroy some very powerful people, and they're still around to protect their interests. The caller's knowledge of Dr. Chen's situation was detailed enough to suggest legitimate inside information. But his motives remained unclear. He could have been a former federal agent, a defense contractor employee, or even someone who had been involved in the original equipment theft and was now concerned about exposure. Sarah, you need to understand that the people who silenced your grattant have vastly more resources and influence now than they had in the 1970s. Marcus continued. They've spent decades building political relationships and accumulating power. They can destroy your career, your finances, and your freedom if you threaten their interests. But Marcus also provided information that suggested potential allies within the government and aerospace industry who might support Sarah's efforts to reveal the truth. Not everyone was complicit in the original cover-up, he said. There are people in NASA, the Pentagon, and Congress who would support legitimate disclosure if the evidence was presented properly. The anonymous caller's final warning was both ominous and encouraging. Yeah, Grayton preserved that evidence because she believed that someday the right person would have the courage and resources to use it effectively. Whether you're that person depends on how carefully you proceed and how effectively you build support before making any public revelations. After ending the call, Sarah understood that her investigation had reached a critical juncture. The attention from government agents, corporate executives, and anonymous insiders indicated that her discovery was significant enough to trigger systematic opposition from interests that had remained hidden for decades. But the opposition also confirmed that Dr. Chen's evidence was as important as it appeared. The equipment in the underground facility represented proof of crimes and cover-ups that could still threaten powerful people and organizations. The classified military space program she had documented might still be operating under different names and authorizations. Sarah's decision about how to proceed would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the future of American space policy and public accountability for military programs that had operated outside congressional oversight for decades. That evening, as Sarah reviewed her options in the ranch house that had become both sanctuary and potential trap, she felt the weight of responsibility that had driven Dr. Margaret Chen to spend 40 years in isolation. The evidence preserved in the underground facility could transform public understanding of American space capabilities, expose systematic fraud that had cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially reveal ongoing classified programs that violated democratic oversight principles. But pursuing that revelation would mean confronting interests that had already demonstrated their willingness to use surveillance, harassment, and federal law enforcement to protect their secrets. But pursuing that revelation would mean confronting interests that had already demonstrated their willingness to use surveillance, harassment, and federal law enforcement to protect their secrets. The same forces that had silenced Dr. Chen were still in power, with even greater resources and influence than they had possessed in the 1970s. The choice Sarah faced was whether to honor her great aunt's sacrifice by continuing her work, or to protect herself by abandoning the investigation and allowing the evidence to remain hidden for another generation. Dr. Morrison's technical validation and Dr. Wright's institutional interest provided hope that legitimate authorities could be mobilized to protect both Sarah and the evidence she had discovered. But the warnings from government agents, corporate executives, and anonymous insiders made clear that the battle for truth about America's space program would require allies. As powerful as the enemies who preferred to keep that truth buried in the desert hills of Kern County, the underground facility that had preserved evidence for 40 years now represented the center of a conflict between those who believed that government secrets should remain hidden indefinitely, and those who believed that democratic societies required accountability for the use of public resources and the conduct of military operations. Sarah Chen had inherited more than a ranch and a collection of aerospace equipment. She had inherited a responsibility to continue her great-aunt's fight for truth, justice, and the principle that scientific advancement should serve humanity, rather than enrich those who possessed the power to steal and suppress whatever they desired. The real test of her courage and commitment was about to begin. The coordinated pressure campaign against Sarah began in earnest. 3 days after her conversations with the government agent and corporate executive, what started as individual contacts quickly escalated into a multi-front assault designed to overwhelm her ability to resist through sheer volume and variety of threats. The first escalation came through her academic institution. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, Sarah's PhD advisor at Stanford, called with barely concealed anxiety about irregularities that had been reported regarding Sarah's graduate research and funding. Status: Sarah, I've received inquiries from the university's Office of Research Integrity about potential security violations related to your dissertation research. Dr. Hoffman explained, her voice tight with the kind of institutional fear that academic careers were built on avoiding. There are allegations that you may have accessed classified materials without proper authorization, which could affect not just your degree status, but the entire aerospace engineering program's federal funding. The attack on Sarah's academic standing was particularly insidious because it threatened not just her own future, but potentially the careers of her advisor and fellow graduate students. Dr. Hoffman is being forced to choose between supporting Sarah and protecting the research program that employed dozens of people and generated millions of dollars in federal contracts. Dr. Hoffman, I haven't accessed any classified materials through university resources, Sarah replied carefully. Any materials I may have encountered were inherited as part of a family estate. I've been working with legitimate experts to ensure proper handling of anything that might have security implications. But her advisor's response revealed the sophistication of the pressure campaign being orchestrated against her. Sarah, the allegations aren't just about current violations. There are questions being raised about your family background and potential security risks that could affect your clearance eligibility for future aerospace work. The reference to her family background was clearly aimed at Dr. Margaret Chen's circumstances and the FBI surveillance that had characterized her final decades. Sarah realized that her great-aunt's persecution was being weaponized to threaten her own academic and professional future. I need you to provide detailed documentation about any aerospace materials you may have encountered, Dr. Hoffman continued, her tone becoming more formal as she shifted into institutional protection mode. The university's legal counsel wants to review your situation before making any decisions about your continued enrollment or research funding. The demand for documentation was an obvious attempt to force Sarah to reveal the scope of her discovery while providing her academic institution with legal cover for terminating her if she refused to cooperate. Stanford University, like most major research institutions, depended heavily on federal contracts and could not afford to be associated with security violations, real or fabricated. Sarah's second challenge came through her financial situation, as the emergency loan she had secured to pay the ranch's property taxes suddenly became subject to enhanced review procedures that threatened to accelerate repayment requirements. Patricia Walsh, from Pacific Coast Credit Union, called with the kind of apologetic tone that bank officials used when delivering financially devastating news.
Ms. Chen,
We've received inquiries from federal regulatory agencies about potential legal complications involving your collateral property. Our compliance department is requiring additional documentation before we can maintain your current loan terms. The financial pressure was designed to force Sarah into an impossible situation. Either provide detailed information about the ranch and its contents to satisfy the bank's compliance requirements, or face immediate loan acceleration that would force her to sell the property to meet her obligations. Ms. Walsh, what specific legal complications are you referring to? Sarah asked, though she already suspected that the same interests pressuring her academically were now targeting her financially. The inquiries relate to potential federal seizure actions and security classifications that could affect the property's value as collateral, Walsh replied, clearly reading from prepared talking points. We need legal assurance that the property isn't subject to government confiscation before we can continue our lending relationship. The threat of property seizure was a new escalation that revealed the scope of resources being mobilized against Sarah. Federal agencies were apparently coordinating with financial institutions to create pressure that would force her to surrender the ranch and its contents without the government having to justify seizure through normal legal processes. But the most disturbing pressure came through threats to her mother's academic career. Dr. Linda Chen received a visit from investigators claiming to represent the Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid, who questioned her about potential security violations related to her daughter's research activities. Sarah, they're suggesting that your activities could affect my research grants and the university's federal funding, her mother explained during an urgent phone call. They want detailed information about our family history, particularly regarding Margaret and any materials you might have inherited. The attack on her mother represented a new level of escalation that demonstrated the perpetrator's willingness to target innocent family members to achieve their objectives. Dr. Linda Chen's biological research had no connection to aerospace, technology, or national security. But her federal funding made her vulnerable to bureaucratic harassment that could destroy her career. Mom, these are the same tactics that were used against Aunt Margaret 40 years ago, Sarah said, her anger overcoming her caution. They're trying to force compliance by threatening everyone connected to me, regardless of their actual involvement. Her mother's response revealed the effectiveness of the intimidation campaign. Sarah, I understand your commitment to this investigation, but I can't lose my career over family secrets that were buried decades ago. The university has already suggested that I might need to distance myself from your situation to protect the research program. The systematic pressure campaign was achieving its intended effect by isolating Sarah from the academic and financial support systems that had enabled her investigation. Her university advisor was being forced to choose institutional protection over student support. Her bank was threatening loan acceleration, and her mother was being pressured to abandon her. But the pressure campaign also revealed the desperation of interests that were willing to risk exposure of their tactics to prevent revelation of Sarah's discovery. The coordination between government agencies, academic institutions, and financial organizations indicated a level of influence that extended far beyond what legitimate security concerns would justify. Sarah's analysis of the pressure tactics led her to recognize patterns that connected her current situation to historical examples of government and corporate suppression of inconvenient discoveries, the same methods that had been used. The academic pressure exploited universities' dependence on federal funding and their inability to resist government pressure when security classifications were invoked, regardless of the legitimacy of such claims. The financial pressure used regulatory agencies to create compliance burdens that banks could not challenge without risking their own federal relationships. The family pressure targeted individuals who had no direct involvement, but whose careers could be destroyed through guilt by association. Most significantly, Sarah realized that the pressure campaign was being orchestrated by interests that possessed detailed knowledge of institutional vulnerabilities and federal bureaucratic processes. Coordination required access to multiple government agencies, academic institutions, and financial organizations that suggested influence networks built over decades of operations. Her research into Dr. Margaret Chen's documentation revealed that the same patterns had been employed against other individuals who had threatened to expose aerospace industry fraud or military program irregularities. The FBI files that Dr. Chen had obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests included references to similar operations against engineers, scientists, and journalists who had investigated classified military activities. One particularly revealing document, dated 1978, described a standard protocol for neutralizing security risks that included academic pressure, financial harassment, and family targeting as primary tactics for encouraging cooperation from individuals who possessed sensitive information. The document had been prepared by something called the Interagency Security Coordination Group, which appeared to be a joint operation involving the Defense Security Service, the FBI, and private contractors who specialized in industrial security management. The group's activities were funded through black budget allocations that provided no public accountability for their operations or expenditures. Sarah realized she was confronting not just corporate fraud or government cover-ups, but a systematic apparatus for suppressing information that threatened powerful interests. The pressure campaign against her was being conducted by professionals who had decades of experience in neutralizing threats to national security operations, regardless of whether those operations were legal, ethical, or constitutionally authorized. But Sarah's research also revealed that the suppression apparatus had vulnerabilities that could be exploited by individuals with sufficient knowledge and determination. Dr. Margaret Chen's files included analysis of successful resistance strategies that had been employed by other targets of similar pressure campaigns. The most effective resistance approach involved building alliances with legitimate authorities who possessed independent power bases and could not be easily intimidated through bureaucratic pressure. Federal judges, congressional oversight committees, and established media organizations retained sufficient independence to resist coordination from security agencies, particularly when presented with compelling evidence of government overreach. Dr. Chen had identified specific individuals within NASA, the Pentagon, and Congress who had maintained integrity despite pressure from military contractors and intelligence agencies. These potential allies shared common interests in government accountability, scientific advancement, and protection of whistleblowers who exposed fraud and corruption. Most importantly, Dr. Chen's analysis suggested that the suppression apparatus was most vulnerable when their targets refused to be isolated and instead built public support through legitimate institutions and media attention. The secrecy that protected classified operations became a liability when their existence was exposed to democratic oversight and public scrutiny. Sarah's recognition of these patterns led her to develop a strategic response that would build on Dr. Chen's analysis while adapting to the changed political and technological environment of the 21st century. Rather than responding defensively to each individual pressure tactic, she would take offensive action designed to expose the systematic nature of the campaign against her. Her first step was documenting the pressure campaign itself as evidence of government overreach and corporate abuse of power. Sarah began recording all phone conversations with officials, preserving emails and letters from institutions, and maintaining detailed logs of intimidation tactics that clearly exceeded legitimate security concerns. The documentation revealed patterns that demonstrated coordination between supposedly independent agencies and organizations. The timing of academic, financial, family pressure indicated advanced planning and information sharing that would be illegal if conducted without proper authorization. The similarity of language and tactics across different institutions suggested central coordination rather than independent responses to legitimate security concerns. Most importantly, Sarah's documentation captured threats and demands that exceeded legal authority, providing evidence that the pressure campaign involved abuse of federal power rather than legitimate law enforcement or security protection. Government agents were making claims about classification and seizure authority that could be challenged in federal court if properly presented through appropriate legal channels. Sarah's second strategic initiative involved reaching out to individuals and organizations that Dr. Chen had identified as potential allies in exposing government and corporate corruption. Her first contact was with Congressman Michael Torres, who chaired the House Subcommittee on Space, Science and Technology, and had a reputation for aggressive oversight of aerospace contractor relationships. The initial conversation with Congressman Torres's chief of staff, Jennifer Martinez, was carefully structured to focus on congressional oversight responsibilities rather than specific allegations that might trigger security classification claims. Ms. Martinez, I'm contacting the Congressman's office because I've inherited documentation that raises questions about historical accountability for NASA, equipment, and contractor relationships that might be relevant to current oversight activities, Sarah explained during their phone conversation. Jennifer Martinez's response indicated both professional interest and institutional caution. Ms. Chen, the congressman, is very committed to ensuring accountability in aerospace contracting, but we need to understand the specific nature of any allegations before we can determine appropriate congressional response. Sarah provided general information about Dr. Chen's documentation of equipment irregularities during the Apollo program era, emphasizing the potential relevance to current NASA operations and contractor oversight rather than making specific accusations that might trigger security concerns. The documentation I've inherited suggests systematic patterns of equipment diversion and financial irregularities that could provide historical context for evaluating current contractor relationships and accountability procedures, Sarah explained. The congressional response was promising enough to encourage further development of the relationship. But Sarah also understood that effective congressional action would require evidence that was compelling enough to overcome the political influence that aerospace contractors maintained through campaign contributions and lobbying relationships. Sarah's third strategic initiative involved contacting investigative journalists who specialized in government accountability and military contractor oversight. Her research identified Maria Santos, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter for The Washington Post who had extensive experience investigating classified military programs and defense contractor fraud. The initial approach to Maria Santos was even more carefully structured than the congressional contact, given the potential for security agencies to monitor communications with journalists who investigated sensitive government operations. Ms. Santos, I'm reaching out because I've inherited family documents that might be relevant to your reporting on aerospace contractor accountability and military spending oversight, Sarah explained during their encrypted phone conversation. Maria Santos's response indicated the professional skepticism that experienced. Investigative reporters brought to unsolicited tips about government conspiracies. Ms. Chen, I received many claims about government cover-ups and corporate fraud. What makes your information different from the usual allegations I hear about classified programs? Sarah provided enough specific detail about Dr. Chen's documentation to demonstrate that her claims were based on substantial evidence rather than speculation or conspiracy theories. The mention of specific NASA equipment serial numbers, contractor, documentation, and FBI surveillance files indicated a level of detail that suggested legitimate insider access rather than fabricated allegations. I'd be interested in examining your documentation, Santos said after hearing Sarah's preliminary summary. But I should warn you that investigating classified military programs often triggers government pressure on both sources and reporters. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential retaliation? The journalist's warning echoed the concerns that Sarah had been hearing from other potential allies. But it also confirmed that her evidence was significant enough to warrant serious investigation by professionals who understood the risks involved in challenging powerful government and corporate interests. Sarah's fourth strategic initiative involved reaching out to legal organizations that specialized in defending whistleblowers and challenging government secrecy. Her research identified the National Security Whistleblower Coalition, which had successfully represented individuals who had exposed classified program abuses and contractor fraud. Attorney Rebecca Thompson, who directed the coalition's legal defense program, provided immediate recognition of the patterns Sarah was experiencing and offered resources that could protect her. From the Escalating Pressure Campaign, Ms. Chen. What you're describing is a classic suppression operation designed to prevent exposure of classified program irregularities, Thompson explained during their consultation. The coordination between academic, financial, and family pressure indicates systematic government involvement that exceeds legitimate security concerns. The legal analysis confirms Sarah's understanding that she was confronting organized opposition rather than legitimate regulatory oversight. But it also provided hope that the pressure campaign's illegal aspects could be challenged through federal court action. We can file protective motions that would prevent government agencies from retaliating against you or your family members while we investigate the legitimacy of their security claims, Thompson continued. If they're abusing classification authority to suppress evidence of fraud or corruption, we can challenge their actions under whistleblower protection statutes. But Attorney Thompson also warned Sarah about the resources and determination that would be required to successfully challenge the forces arrayed against her. These operations are conducted by professionals who have decades of experience in suppressing inconvenient information. Success requires not just compelling evidence, but also sustained political and media pressure that can overcome their influence. Networks. As Sarah concluded her initial outreach to potential allies, she understood that her situation had evolved from a personal inheritance issue into a test case for democratic accountability and government transparency. The evidence she had inherited represented proof of systematic fraud and cover-ups that extended far beyond her great-aunt's personal circumstances. The pressure campaign against her was revealing the continued existence of suppression apparatus that had operated for decades to protect classified programs and corporate interests from public scrutiny. Her resistance was challenging not just specific individuals or organizations, but an entire system designed to prevent democratic oversight of military operations and contractor relationships. The allies she was building represented the best hope for exposing that system and ensuring that Dr. Margaret Chen's 40-year struggle to preserve evidence of government and corporate corruption would finally achieve the justice and accountability that had driven her to sacrifice everything for truth. But Sarah also understood that the real battle was just beginning. The forces that had silenced Dr. Chen possessed even greater resources and influence than they had commanded in the 1970s. And they would escalate their pressure campaign as her resistance efforts gained momentum and credibility. The underground facility that had preserved evidence for 4 decades was about to become the epicenter of a conflict that would determine whether democratic societies could maintain accountability for classified operations in military contractor relationships, or whether such programs would remain permanently beyond public oversight and constitutional constraint. The next phase of Sarah's fight would test not just her own courage and determination, but the strength of American democratic institutions when confronted with systematic abuse of power by nurses that had spent decades accumulating influence. While operating beyond public accountability, the turning point in Sarah's battle came when attorney Rebecca Thompson filed a federal lawsuit that would transform her from a defensive target into an offensive force capable of exposing the systematic suppression apparatus that had operated in the shadows for decades. The lawsuit, filed in the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California, alleged violations of Sarah's constitutional rights, abuse of federal power, and criminal conspiracy to suppress evidence of government contractor fraud. But, more importantly, it triggered discovery procedures that would force government agencies and defense contractors to produce documents explaining their coordinated pressure campaign. Sarah, by filing this lawsuit, were essentially declaring war on a system that has operated without accountability for 40 years, Attorney Thompson explained, as they prepared for the inevitable retaliation. But we're also activating legal protections that will make it much more difficult for them to continue their harassment without facing criminal liability themselves. The federal lawsuit immediately attracted attention from the same congressional and media allies that Sarah had been cultivating, creating momentum that would prove impossible for the suppression apparatus to contain through their traditional tactics. Congressman Michael Torres announced that his House Subcommittee on Space Science and Technology would conduct formal hearings into allegations of historical aerospace contractor fraud and government cover-ups. The congressional investigation would provide official legitimacy for Sarah's claims, while creating legal protections that prevented agencies from retaliating against witnesses and whistleblowers. The American people deserve to know the truth about how their tax dollars were spent during the Apollo program and whether equipment that could have advanced space exploration was instead diverted for corporate profit, Congressman Torres announced. During a press conference that transformed Sarah's personal struggle into a national political issue, the congressional announcement was perfectly timed to coincide with Maria Santos's first Washington Post article about Sarah's discovery, creating a media firestorm that brought public attention to allegations that could no longer be suppressed through bureaucratic harassment. Inherited Ranch reveals hidden cache of Apollo equipment worth millions. Read the headline that would ultimately trigger the collapse of the suppression apparatus that had protected aerospace contractor fraud for decades. Maria Santos's investigative reporting was meticulous and devastating, combining Sarah's evidence with independent research that confirmed the systematic nature of equipment diversion during the Apollo program era. The Post's resources enabled verification of Dr. Margaret Chen's documentation through multiple sources, creating an unshakable foundation for allegations that aerospace contractors had stolen millions of dollars worth of NASA equipment. But Santos's reporting also revealed the contemporary relevance of the historical fraud, connecting Dr. Chen's discoveries to current space program inefficiencies and cost overruns that suggested similar patterns of contractor abuse continued to affect NASA operations. The equipment preserved at Whispering Pines Ranch represents not just historical artifacts, but proof of systematic practices that may continue to inflate aerospace contracting costs and delay space exploration progress. Santos wrote in her second article, which focused on the modern implications of Dr. Chen's evidence. The media attention triggered additional sources who came forward with their own evidence of aerospace contractor fraud and government cover-ups, creating an avalanche of revelations that overwhelmed the suppression apparatus's ability to contain individual cases through harassment and intimidation. Dr. David Richardson, a former Titan aerospace engineer, contacted Maria Santos with internal company documents proving that the equipment diversion documented by Dr. Chen had continued well into the 1980s and 1990s. His evidence included engineering specifications, financial records, and executive communications that confirmed systematic theft of NASA technology for use in classified military programs. I've kept these documents for 20 years, waiting for someone with the courage to expose what we were doing, Dr. Richardson told Santos during a recorded interview. Margaret Chen was right about everything, and the people who silenced her are still in positions of power throughout the aerospace industry. Dr. Richardson's revelations were particularly damaging because they included evidence of ongoing relationships between Titan Aerospace and current defense contractors. That the criminal networks exposed by Dr. Chen's investigation had evolved rather than disappeared over the decades. The growing coalition of whistleblowers and evidence sources created momentum that attracted support from unexpected quarters within the government itself. NASA Administrator Dr. Jennifer Walsh announced that the space agency would fully cooperate with congressional investigations and would conduct its own internal review of historical contractor relationships and equipment accountability procedures. NASA is committed to transparency and accountability in all our operations. Dr. Walsh stated during a press conference that marked the agency's official break with the cover-up that had protected contractor fraud for 40 years. If evidence exists of historical irregularities in our contractor relationships, we want that information revealed and addressed through appropriate legal and administrative procedures. The NASA administrator's support was particularly significant because it provided Sarah's investigation with official government backing, making it impossible for other agencies to dismiss her evidence as unsubstantiated conspiracy theories or security threats. But the most dramatic validation of Sarah's efforts came when FBI Director Robert Martinez announced that the Bureau was opening a criminal investigation into allegations of systematic contractor fraud and government cover-ups related to aerospace programs dating back to the 1970s. The evidence that has been brought to our attention suggests criminal violations that may have continued for decades, Director Martinez announced. The FBI is committed to investigating these allegations thoroughly and prosecuting any individuals or organizations that may have defrauded the American taxpayers or obstructed justice to conceal such crimes. The FBI announcement represented a complete reversal of the Bureau's historical role in suppressing Dr. Chen's evidence, demonstrating how effectively Sarah's alliance-building strategy had isolated the interests that had protected the fraud for decades. With congressional media, NASA, and FBI support mobilized behind her investigation, Sarah was finally in a position to reveal the full scope of Dr. Chen's evidence without fear of retaliation or suppression. The underground facility at Whispering Pines Ranch became the site of an extraordinary press conference that would transform public understanding of American space program capabilities and contractor accountability. The event, attended by congressional representatives, NASA officials, aerospace experts, and international media, featured a guided tour of the preserved Apollo equipment that Dr. Chen had rescued from destruction 40 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing here represents one of the most significant collections of Apollo program hardware outside of NASA's official archives. Now, Dr. Robert Morrison explained as he guided the tour through the underground facility. This equipment was supposed to have been destroyed when the Apollo program was terminated, but instead it was preserved by a woman who understood its historical and scientific significance better than the bureaucrats who ordered its disposal. The media coverage of the press conference was unprecedented, with live television broadcasts, detailed photographic documentation, and expert analysis that confirmed the authenticity and significance of Dr. Chen's preservation efforts. The images of the lunar module ascent engine, life support systems, and scientific instruments provided visual proof of government and contractor fraud that could not be dismissed or disputed. But Sarah's revelation of the Apollo equipment was overshadowed by her presentation of evidence related to the classified military space programs that Dr. Chen had discovered. The photographic evidence of lunar installations, mission documentation, and equipment specifications provided proof of space capabilities that exceeded anything publicly acknowledged by the American government. The evidence preserved by Dr. Margaret Chen demonstrates that the United States achieved space capabilities in the 1970s that remain classified today, Sarah announced during her presentation to the assembled officials and media representatives. While the public was told that budget constraints had ended lunar exploration, classified military programs were actually expanding American presence in space using technology that was diverted from civilian programs. The revelation of classified space capabilities triggered immediate demands for congressional oversight and public accountability for programs that had operated outside democratic supervision for decades. The evidence suggested that American space achievements had far exceeded public knowledge. While taxpayers had been denied access to technologies that could have advanced civilian space exploration and scientific research, Congressman Torres announced that his committee would demand declassification of historical space program documents and full accounting for resources that had been diverted from civilian programs to classified military operations. The American people have a right to know what their government has achieved in space and how their tax dollars have been spent, Congressman Torres stated. If we have capabilities that could advance space exploration and scientific research, those capabilities should serve the public interest rather than remaining hidden for the benefit of military contractors and classified operations. The congressional demand for declassification created political pressure that even the most powerful aerospace contractors could not resist through their traditional influence networks. The combination of media attention, FBI investigation, and congressional oversight had created accountability mechanisms that superseded the private relationships that had protected the cover-up for decades. Within 6 months of Sarah's press conference, the results of her investigation had transformed both her personal circumstances and the broader landscape of aerospace accountability and government transparency. The FBI investigation led to criminal indictments against 12 individuals, including current and former executives of Titan Aerospace Corporation, government officials who had facilitated the equipment diversion, and federal agents who had abused their authority to suppress evidence. and harass witnesses. General Harrison Blackwood, the founder of Titan Aerospace, is charged with conspiracy to defraud the government, theft of federal property, and obstruction of justice. His arrest at age 89 marked the end of a criminal career that had spanned nearly 50 years of systematic exploitation of government contracts and abuse of political influence. The criminal prosecutions recovered over $400 million in fraudulent proceeds and resulted in prison sentences for individuals who had believed their political connections made them immune from accountability. The message to other aerospace contractors was clear. Systematic fraud and cover-ups would no longer be protected by political influence or classification claims. The congressional investigation led to sweeping reforms in aerospace contractor oversight, including mandatory public reporting of equipment disposition, independent auditing of classified program expenditures, and whistleblower protections that prevented the kind of harassment that Dr. Chen had endured. Most significantly, the investigation forced partial declassification of historical military space programs, revealing achievements that transformed public understanding of American space capabilities and generated support for expanded civilian space exploration programs. The declassified information confirmed that the United States had indeed established a permanent lunar presence in the 1970s, using technology and resources that had been diverted from the civilian Apollo program. The revelation generated enormous public interest in space exploration and political support for NASA programs that could build on the classified achievements to advance scientific research and space colonization. Sarah's personal transformation was equally dramatic. The graduate student who had inherited a ranch to pay off family debts had become a nationally recognized advocate for government accountability and space exploration advancement. Stanford University, which had threatened to terminate her graduate studies, instead awarded her an honorary doctorate in aerospace engineering and established the Margaret Chen Center for Space Policy. Research in honor of her great sacrifice and Sarah's courage in continuing her work. The aerospace industry, which had attempted to suppress her investigation, instead offered her consulting opportunities and research positions that recognized her expertise in historical space, program analysis, and government contractor oversight. Most importantly, Sarah had discovered a calling that extended far beyond her original academic interests. The fight for truth and accountability had revealed talents and commitments that would shape the rest of her professional life. The Whispering Pines Ranch, which had nearly been lost to tax foreclosure, became the permanent site of the Margaret Chen Memorial Space Research Institute, a facility that combined museum displays of preserved Apollo equipment with active research. Programs focused on space exploration, technology, and government accountability. The institute, funded through a combination of federal appropriations, private donations, and aerospace industry contributions, attracted researchers from around the world who studied both the historical achievements preserved by Dr. Chen and the contemporary implications of space exploration for human development. Sarah's role as director of the institute allowed her to continue her greatness work while building on the foundation of accountability and transparency that their combined efforts had established. The underground facility that had hidden evidence for 40 years became a research center that advanced both scientific knowledge and democratic oversight of government programs. The transformation extended beyond individual careers and institutional changes to broader cultural and political shifts that would influence American space policy for generations. The revelation of classified space achievements generated public demand for expanded civilian space programs that could build on military developments to advance scientific research, space colonization, and international cooperation. NASA's budget increased dramatically as Congress and the public recognized that space exploration represented both national security interests and opportunities for scientific advancement that could benefit all humanity. The aerospace industry, chastened by criminal prosecutions and congressional oversight, embraced transparency and accountability measures that reduced costs, improved efficiency, and restored public confidence in government contracting relationships. Most significantly, is the precedent established by Sarah's successful challenge to systematic suppression, created protections for future whistleblowers and accountability advocates who would expose government fraud and corporate abuse in other sectors. 5 years after Sarah had first opened the steel door in the hillside behind Whispering Pines Ranch, she stood in the same location during a ceremony marking the completion of the Margaret Chen Memorial Space Research Institute's new facilities. The ceremony was attended by NASA administrators, congressional representatives, aerospace industry leaders, and international space researchers who had come to recognize the institute as a premier center for space policy research and historical preservation. Today we celebrate not just the completion of these research facilities, but the vindication of a principle that my great-aunt died defending, Sarah said during her dedication speech. Dr. Margaret Chen believed that scientific discoveries belong to humanity, not to the powerful interests who possess the resources to claim and suppress whatever they desire. The audience included many individuals whose careers and lives had been transformed by the accountability movement that Sarah's investigation had catalyzed. Dr. David Richardson, the former Titan aerospace engineer whose whistleblowing had supported the criminal prosecutions, now directed the Institute's Aerospace Industry Oversight Program. Maria Santos, whose investigative reporting had exposed the systematic fraud, had won a Pulitzer Prize and continued covering government accountability issues. But the most honored guest at the ceremony was Dr. Robert Morrison, the retired NASA engineer whose validation of the Apollo equipment had provided crucial credibility for Sarah's initial claims. At age 78, Dr. Morrison had become the Institute's chief technical advisor and had dedicated his remaining career to ensuring that the preserved Apollo technology contributed to current space exploration programs. Margaret Chen's preservation of this equipment has already advanced our current lunar exploration capabilities by years and saved taxpayers billions of dollars. Dr. Morrison explained during his presentation about the Institute's technical research programs. The design principles and manufacturing techniques we've analyzed from the preserved components have improved propulsion efficiency, life support reliability, and scientific instrument capabilities for the Artemis program. In future Mars missions, the technical achievements were impressive, but Sarah understood that the Institute's most important contribution was the precedent it had established for democratic accountability and scientific integrity in an era when powerful interests possessed unprecedented resources for suppressing inconvenient truths. As evening approached and the dedication ceremony concluded, Sarah walked alone to the spot where her desperate search for family history had first led her, to the steel door that concealed Dr. Chen's evidence. The door now stood permanently open, its passage illuminated and welcoming rather than hidden and forbidding. The transformation represented more than architectural change or institutional success. It symbolized the victory of democratic principles over authoritarian suppression, scientific advancement over corporate exploitation, and individual integrity over systematic corruption. Dr. Margaret Chen had spent 40 years in isolation, preserving evidence that she believed would someday serve justice and human advancement. Her sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, but only because someone else had possessed the courage to continue her work despite facing the same systematic opposition that had silenced her. Sarah understood that the real victory was not the criminal prosecutions, congressional reforms, or scientific discoveries that had resulted from her investigation. The real victory was the demonstration that ordinary individuals could successfully challenge the most powerful interests in society when they chose principle over comfort and truth over convenience. The Margaret Chen Memorial Space Research Institute would continue advancing space exploration and government accountability for generations. But its most important legacy was the proof that democratic societies could maintain oversight of classified design programs and military contractor relationships when citizens possessed the courage to demand transparency and justice. As Sarah looked out over the high desert landscape that had sheltered her great-aunt's secrets for 4 decades, she felt profound gratitude for the crisis that had forced her to dig into family history and uncover evidence that had transformed both her own life and the broader trajectory of American space policy. The inheritance that had seemed like a financial burden had become the foundation for achievements that would influence humanity's future among the stars. The ranch that had nearly been lost to tax foreclosure had become a center for research, an education that would advance scientific knowledge and democratic accountability for decades to come. But most importantly, Sarah had discovered that individual action could catalyze collective change when guided by integrity, supported by truth, and committed to serving interests larger than personal convenience or safety. Dr. Margaret Chen's 40-year struggle had finally achieved vindication, but only because her great niece had chosen to honor that struggle. By continuing the fight for justice and accountability that defines the best traditions of democratic society and scientific advancement, the underground facility that had preserved evidence of systematic fraud and cover-ups had become a symbol of hope that truth could eventually triumph over oppression, that individual integrity could overcome institutional corruption, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they chose to stand firm against exploitation and abuse of power. The stars above Whispering Pines Ranch shone with the same clarity that had inspired Dr. Chen's original commitment to space exploration and scientific advancement, but now they also represented the promise that humanity's future among those stars would be guided by principles of transparency, accountability, and shared benefit rather than exploitation and suppression. Sarah Chen had inherited more than a ranch and a collection of aerospace equipment. She had inherited a responsibility to continue humanity's greatest adventure, the exploration of space and the advancement of knowledge, while ensuring that such endeavors served the interests of all people, rather than enriching those who possessed the power to claim whatever they desired. The real journey to the stars had begun not with rockets and spacecraft, but with the choice to stand firm for truth and justice, regardless of the personal cost. That choice, made first by Dr. Margaret Chen and then by her great-niece, had ultimately made possible achievements that would influence human civilization for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.